It started with the evergreens, the beautiful looming trees that are the backdrop of the Pacific Northwest, the trees that fueled a booming lumber industry, which in turn helped establish an entire region of the U.S. Fortunes were made here, and over time, fortunes were given away. This is the story of one man, a humble fellow with humble beginnings who made his fortune not just from lumber, but from an idea so innovative that it would revolutionize the way American homes were built. But it is what he did with his fortune that makes this story unique. It was the act of giving back to communities large and small that would make his name synonymous with Northwest philanthropy. As he looked out across the great forests of fir, spruce, and hemlock, one has to wonder if he had any idea that one day those trees would enable him to sponsor youth teams for thousands of children, build ballparks, fund food banks, libraries, and hospitals. One has to wonder if Ben B. Cheney had any idea that someday his legacy would last as long, loom as large as those big, beautiful trees. From lumber to airplanes, television to software, the Pacific Northwest is a cradle for innovative industry. Names like Boeing, Bullitt, Allen and Gates are linked with some of the nation's greatest entrepreneurial achievements and most profound acts of philanthropy. But there is another name that belongs in that group. Businessman and community supporter, Ben B. Cheney. Ben's contribution to industry, development and standardization of the 8-foot lumber stud, was an innovation that changed home building in America. And it was his innovative approach to philanthropy that makes him a true icon of the Northwest. In 1975, the year the Ben B. Cheney Foundation was funded, foundations were a new concept in the Pacific Northwest and in philanthropy. A practical evolution from single check-based giving, philanthropic foundations ensured long-term giving and long-term solutions.
And the Cheney Foundation was on the leading edge of that, because they started at the very beginning of the 70s when there were few foundations here. And the Gates Foundation hadn't even been thought of yet. And so the Cheney Foundation, I think, has been a role model for many other organizations in our community over these years, and been a kind of real bellwether for what is now developed as this very rich and diverse philanthropic culture here in the Puget Sound.
Ben Cheney came from an entrepreneurial family, a family that was about expansion and a uniquely American drive to push boundaries. In 1911, in what was their final westward move, his grandparents arrived in South Bend, Washington. Originally from Pennsylvania, they had married in Iowa, farmed in Nebraska, and opened their first photography studio in Lima, Montana, before moving to Washington. Lima, Montana, in 1905, was a small town with an unspectacular past. It was in Lima that Ben was born, and it was in Lima that he would suffer some of the most significant difficulties of his life. At the age of 9, Ben lost his mother. Soon after that numbing hardship, his father turned the care of Ben and his sister Lula over to their grandparents. So at a young age, Ben too found himself pushing westward, heading from Montana to South Bend, Washington, with a grandmother and a grandfather who would teach him about grit, flexibility, and entrepreneurship. In South Bend, Ben would have his first brush with the ongoing love of his life, baseball. And it was a local South Bend priest, Father Victor Couveret, that first pointed him towards it. On Father Couveret's team, Ben was, in his own words, a good field no-hit shortstop, and he fell in love with the game. And it was this early experience with sports that stayed with him throughout his life, giving him personal enjoyment and influencing the support of youth sports and activities that would begin and define his philanthropic efforts. Like his grandparents before him, Ben also moved when the place he was in seemed too small. At 19, he departed South Bend and headed for the larger city of Tacoma. In Tacoma, Ben found himself broke and unemployed. Desperate for work, he prepared to head to the tide flats at Tacoma to apply for a job with the Dempsey Lumber Company.
So he had this streetcar pass that the transit issued, a weekly streetcar pass. He and his friend had one pass between them. And he told the friend, as I recall the story, he told the kid to get on, but throw the pass out the back door of the streetcar, and he'd catch the next streetcar downtown. So the kid did. He threw it out the back door, and I guess Ben had a little trouble finding it. But he got on the streetcar, went downtown Tacoma, transferred to the tide flats, applied for the job, got the job. Now, if he had missed the pass, couldn't find it, he may never have been in the lumber industry at all. So I think it's quite a fascinating story.
At Dempsey, Ben worked as a stenographer, a position that allowed him to see and hear how the company worked. Deciding he was ready for advancement, in 1929, he moved on to Fairhurst Lumber, where he was named office manager. Eventually, Ben's restless spirit pushed him to expand his boundaries from employee to owner, and in 1936, he formed the Cheney Lumber Company. Ben decided to stake his business on railroad ties, and he found a mill to produce them. But the country, deep in a depression, wasn't buying. So resourceful and energetic, Ben headed overseas to China, where he received a significant order. This order proved an invaluable starting point for the company, and by the time the 30s were drawing to a close, Cheney Lumber was the largest supplier of ties to the North American railroad industry. Ben's business was not without difficulties. The small timber tracts where Cheney Lumber set up their portable mills were becoming more expensive, and the waste produced from cutting the ties was enormous. Ben Cheney was the kind of person who liked to solve problems. Still, he couldn't figure out what to do with the slab waste from his railroad ties, and his frustration was mounting. So he tried out ideas. Fence posts, broom handles, toothpicks. None worked. Then one night, he went to bed as usual and woke up in the middle of the night with the answer: the 8-foot stud. Before this point in time, carpenters cut studs in all kinds of lengths when constructing new homes. This resulted in widely varying and often inefficient ceiling heights. But with Ben's idea, 8-foot studs could now be mass-produced from railroad tie waste. This standard stud size would make homes less costly to build and less costly to heat. Literally overnight, Ben Cheney had come up with an idea that was as simple as it was game-changing for architecture in America. His 8-foot stud would come to define the look of the American mid-century home. It was an idea that would change his life, and it was an idea so revolutionary, he thought it wise to put his own stamp on it.
Later on, he adapted another idea of painting the ends so they can be identifiable with a wax motion red. And that was a patented thing. I think we almost had to go to Supreme Court to get that cleared, but it was recognizable as a Cheney stud.
Ben's revolutionary idea eventually provided him with a fortune that helped give birth to a foundation. And it was this foundation that would change not just homes, but the lives and the futures of countless people. With the development of the 8-foot stud, Ben's business took off. And with his marriage in 1954 to wife Marion, his personal life fell into place as well. Settled comfortably into life in Tacoma, and with his business growing, Ben began to show signs of what would become an ongoing commitment. In the 1950s, he began to create and sponsor youth sports teams, not only in Tacoma, but in many of the communities where Cheney Lumber had mills. Ben became the go-to guy if a youth team needed uniforms or help of any kind. Over the years, more than 5,000 children played on Cheney studs or other Cheney-sponsored youth teams.
The Cheney studs in the era of the 1960s, 70s, and so forth, everybody in the Puget Sound area knew about the Cheney studs. They were a special team. I think everybody regarded them that way. I think that everybody was in awe that Ben would sponsor that many teams.
Among all the youth teams that Ben supported, one stood out: the Cheney Stud Courtiers, a Tacoma version of the Harlem Globetrotters. This team of young basketball tricksters could spin, dribble, pass, and weave. Piled into Cheney-funded vans, The boys traveled all over the region, putting on shows for young and old alike. They became a source of local pride and an aspiration for many young people. The Cheney Stud Courtiers were fun to watch, a dream to join.
Ben sponsored so many different teams. Soccer. I was surprised when I saw youth hockey. So soccer and youth hockey and basketball and baseball and football and all those. And they had great teams that won national championships. But for my money, the greatest teams were the Cheney Stud Courtiers.
His fortune at new heights, Ben was eventually able to fulfill the dream of a lifetime. Partial ownership of a Major League Baseball team, the San Francisco Giants. He was also able to help Tacoma in another way, using his clout in the community and his considerable bank account to help fund and build, in 3 months, the local ballpark, Cheney Stadium. But his contribution to building the stadium and his role in Major League Baseball never surpassed what he thought was his primary responsibility, helping young people.
I can still look over and see Ben beaming with pride that something that he perhaps didn't accomplish as a young man, he now could see it in the people that he sponsored.
But Ben's commitment to youth wasn't just an obligation. Like most things in his life, it was something he found joy in. And Ben, it seemed, found joy in everything. He was always up to something: boating, hunting, fishing, and playing with his children. Spending long afternoons watching his youth teams play ball. It wasn't like him to let a day pass without engaging in something that would let laughter pass through him.
He used to answer the telephone when I would transfer the phone to him, and he would say, "Fresh fish." I don't know if anybody has brought that up, but that's so comical. Here's this man, this bright, bright man, and he'd say, "Fresh fish," but he had a marvelous sense of humor.
Another time he told me about a place on Puyallup Avenue that sold hot dogs. Ben had found the best hot dogs in the Pacific Northwest, and these were side personal things. Ben loved life, he loved humor, he loved jokes. All of his friends loved him for it.
Work also brought Ben happiness. Cheney Lumber consisted of mills throughout 3 states, producing millions of 8-foot studs, a considerable business to oversee. Still, the challenges of running it rarely seemed to get him down.
Oh, I think he liked coming to work because it was his invention. He was a smart inventor. His work, his development of all of his ideas, and I think he liked to come and see the materialization of those dreams.
For Ben, it was all about having fun. And if you were lucky enough to know Ben, you had fun too. As his business grew and his dreams continued to materialize, Ben sought out new ways to give back, becoming a major community contributor, not only in Tacoma, but in the other mill towns where his company operated. Tacoma, Willapa Harbor, Chehalis, Vancouver, Myrtle Point, Central Point, Arcata, Pondosa, and Greenville. Washington, Oregon, California. The mills in these towns produced a product renowned for its quality.
The impressions were these. You're dealing with a company that's selling the Cadillac of lumber, Cadillac of studs.
The Cheney lumber mills were the engines of Ben's success. Today, some 25 years after the last one closed, the Cheney Foundation continues its contribution to the communities that housed these mills.
And so geographically, they've stayed focused. They've stayed focused on education and health care and the key needs of those communities, and they've stayed after it year after year after year. They've not wandered.
People often ask where we give our dollars to and where we make our grants. Well, the number one thing we tell people is that we give to the areas where we made our living. And so we go into the small lumber towns and areas where we had timberlands to return and make grants in those areas. So our philosophy really has been give back where we made our money. And we get to go to a lot of small places that don't have mills anymore, that are distressed. And really that's been a good recipe for us, I think, as far as trying to give back in those communities. About 50% of our giving is here in Tacoma, Pierce County. This is where our headquarters were, and then the rest is shared among those areas in the Pacific Northwest where we operated.
Ben's wife, Marion, who passed away just as the foundation was beginning in the mid-70s, shared with Ben a vision for providing assistance to community. and she supported this vision with a considerable contribution from her estate, a contribution that helped fund the innovative programs that were to come.
The first year of funding for EFN was provided by the Cheney Foundation, almost exclusively. So that's how important it is to the beginning of EFN.
It was this partnership that helped establish a role for the Emergency Food Network in a cannery in Kent, Washington, and later helped them establish an organic farm to produce and grow their own food. And it was a partnership between the Cheney Foundation and Tacoma General Hospital's Oncology Department that helped fund an innovative and widely replicated healing environment program that has been used in cancer, hospice, and other medical surgical units.
I think that it has spread far beyond what we ever thought it would and has made a real impact on how we care for patients, especially the cancer patients. And I think a great deal of that success is related to the relationship between Multicare and the Cheney Foundation.
They have a sense of community. They have a sense of what is correct. One of the things that the Cheney Foundation has never asked for, in my opinion, is accolades as a result. That is not why the foundation does what it does. Its importance to this community can't be over-exaggerated, not only because it's a source of funding, but because it is an important weave in the fabric of life here.
Ben Cheney is no longer here, but his presence through his family and the ongoing work of his foundation is still felt throughout the region. By the end of 2009, after 34 years of grant-making, the foundation has given over $75 million to more than 1,200 organizations in the communities where Ben's lumber company was active. His presence is also felt literally. A statue of him, complete right down to the laughing eyes, sits in a corner of Tacoma's Cheney Stadium, watching every inning of every game.
Well, he's looking down on us, I'm sure, and saying, you know, Cheney Stadium after 50 years is still an ideal venue for baseball. And he should and would and could and will take great pride in what he gave to the community.
Legacy was important to Ben, but it was not Cheney Stadium or the 8-foot stud that mattered most. For Ben, his legacy is his family.
Somewhere in heaven he is saying, look what I did. Look what I have done. My children are healthy, wonderful parents, philanthropic. They're just what I dreamed they would turn out to be. And that's his legacy.
In the end, it is his family that will carry on his legacy through the work of the Ben B. Cheney Foundation. And it is the foundation that will keep Ben forever connected to the Pacific Northwest.
My hope is in 10 or 20 years the next generation of Cheney family is running this foundation, and we continue to do the work we've done for really the last 30 years.
Because Ben Cheney started with nothing, used innovative smarts and good business sense to achieve phenomenal success, it is easy to view his life as the classic story of the American dream. But this is also a story of a dream that was shared, because Ben showed us that it was possible to build a prosperous life while never forgetting the people and places that helped him along the way. And that while his time here was brief, the legacy he left is everlasting.